Hello, Sid Roth here. Welcome to my world, where it's naturally supernatural. How would you like to recapture the glory, the presence of God that was on the first Jewish believers in the Messiah? How would you like to recapture the power that was on those first Jewish believers? Peter would walk by, in his shadow, people would be healed. Well, my guest, John Fenn, has had 3 visitations from the Messiah of Israel in which the Messiah has instructed him carefully of what the first Jewish believers in the Messiah had that we do not have today. I want to find out. John, tell me about that first visitation.
Well, the first one actually was a bit of a history lesson. I was kind of minding my own business, praying and worshiping one night in the living room. My wife had already gone to bed, and suddenly the Lord was there. And he came over and actually sat down in the spirit. Suddenly I could see both in the spirit realm and the natural. And he said this. He said, I want to teach you a little bit. And of course, I was born again in the charismatic renewal of the 1970s, late 60s, early 70s. So he said this: you are a product of what you call the charismatic renewal. He said, at that time, many of my people came out of the denominational churches because their needs weren't being met. And he said, and thus what you would call parachurch organizations started. And you heard of prayer groups and Bible studies, people meeting on their own. He said, out of that sprang up a whole new breed of churches, a whole new generation of churches. And he said, you're a product of that. And that was exactly the case. And then he said this. He said, but many of those churches have become as rigid and structured and set on their own agenda as the denominational churches that preceded them. And once again, you're going to hear of my people leaving them because their needs aren't being met, because they want more of me. That was a little bit scary, because I was a pastor of a traditional church. But he said,
so he's saying there's going to be, within your mind, a whole new paradigm different than what we've known previously.
And when he said that many of that generation, the churches that were birthed in the 70s, 80s, 90s, etc., have become as rigid, inflexible, and set on their own agenda as the generation that preceded them, that I had to plead guilty. I was as guilty as anyone else as a pastor. 4 songs, announcements, worship, get to the buffet line before the next church down the street. And it began birthing in me a desire to just let go and let God. That why did we have to cut off the worship if the worship was going strong and the presence of God was so strong? And so that was the summation of that. It started that first visitation was a real time of checking and double checking and comparing the way church was done in the first century and the way that church is done today all over the world. There's a big difference.
Well, briefly, what did you find?
Well, so many different things. One of the first things that I noted was that every single book in the New Testament, from Matthew to Revelation, was written to people in living rooms. There were no big buildings at the time or anything like that. Secondly, not a single letter in the New Testament was written to leaders. In other words, it doesn't start and say to the elders and everything. The word pastor, the idea of the pastor being the head, came about 300 and some years later. It was jointly governed by the people. I discovered that when I was reading some of the problems, look, for instance, in the 1 Corinthians letter, there was a situation with incest. And Paul said, you should have handled it. He didn't say, get the pastor, get the elders. He said, you should have handled it. In the very next chapter, 2 brothers are suing one another. And he says the same thing. Instead of get the leaders or anything, he says, you should have handled it. Why don't you guys pick 2 of the least in the church and let them decide the issue?
As a matter of fact, you talk about the whole paradigm of church was Constantine.
That's right. In 313 AD, I believe it was, he issued what's called the Edict of Milan, which legalized Christianity, which brought Christians out of the homes that they'd been in for more than 2 centuries, and actually gave them a bunch of money, took over pagan temples, and set up the auditorium-style church that we have today. Now, I'm not against the churches by any means. God will fill whatever structure that man gives him.
Of course.
But the very first structure that God gave him was the family.
Okay, so if we want to get back what that first group of Jewish believers had, we have to do what they did according to the Bible. We had a second visitation.
In February of 2001, I was about to minister in the Toronto area, And during the worship, suddenly the Lord was there, right up by the worship team, about 6 or 7 steps away. And he came walking over to me. And one of the things he said was this: see what I see. People running to and fro to this meeting and that, looking for the spectacular, thinking that's supernatural. But they miss the supernatural work in their midst and in their heart, for the process of discipleship is supernatural. And he said some other things. He said this: as it was in the beginning, so it must be now, I'm moving in relationships. Well, that launched about a 9 or 10 month study of the Word to look at the relationships, to look more deeply at how it's actually practiced. And I found, again, that when I was reading Corinthians and Colossians and Thessalonians, that these were actually people who were named in the book of Acts, who hosted these churches. Lydia in Philippi, Jason in Thessalonica. You can go down through the names. And so I was realizing I was reading real letters to real people sitting in living rooms who were in relationship. Deep relationship.
Deep relationship is important to God. Is that what you're saying?
And relationship accountability comes through relationship. And that's exactly right. I like to say that Christianity started as a relationship in Israel when God came to man. He went to Greece to become a philosophy, to Rome, to Europe to become a tradition and part of the culture, and then to America to become an enterprise.
That's quite a mouthful. We'll be back in just a moment. But he had a third visitation. Don't go away. Be right back.
We'll be right back to It's Supernatural.
It was God's purpose from the beginning for all nations to become one in Yeshua, Messiah Jesus. To break down the middle wall of separation between Jew and Gentile. When Jewish spiritual DNA merges with the new covenant Christian DNA, there will be what Paul called life from the dead. That's why Sid Roth's website is loaded with cutting-edge articles and teaching man. Log on to sidroth.org today.
We now return to It's Supernatural.
Hello, Sid Roth here with John Fenn. And John had 3 visitations from the Messiah of Israel in which the Messiah told him how to recapture what the first Jewish believers in the Messiah had. And John, tell me about this third visitation.
Well, the third one was later that same year in November of 2001. Again, I was up in Canada ministering. This is so important because it demonstrates the heart of Yeshua. It was in a church that really ministered to former drug addicts, prostitutes, the red light district. And in the middle of the worship service, after I had already contemplated this, in fact, a couple weeks earlier, I told my wife, I said, I don't want to pastor a church again, but if I ever did, it would be in my living room, just like the Apostle Paul did. And so when the Lord appeared in this worship service and came walking over, the first thing he said as he's walking is, I love these kinds of people. And it was so important because that's the heart of the Lord. There are no facades on people who've been through difficulties in life and such. And he came walking over, and the power of God was so strong. And I won't say he turned it up, but the pastor next to me fell first to his knees, then flat on his face. That my strength left me, fell to my knees. And the 3 guys that we brought with us said that they saw the Lord that night and he walked right past them later. But he said, you've learned much from the people I've brought across your path and your studies in the Word the last few months. Now I want you to start a house church and a house church network. And I want you to structure it in such a way to facilitate the development of house churches around the world. And I said, why? What? And he said this. He said, it's against a time to come to resource and be a resource to them. Now this is in 2001. And so a time to come, against a time to come is saying that it will be a provision for a time to come. And now, of course, we have a network that spans home-based churches, but the point is it's relationship-based faith. It's relationship-based Christianity, meeting people exactly where they are in life. So we're very much aware.
Now how would this differ from, say, a traditional church that has house groups?
House churches and cell churches are 2 separate animals completely. A house church is completely autonomous, on its own, independent, taking care of each other's needs. A cell church still is attached to the larger church where the main meeting is a large congregational meeting. A house church, see, we've discovered that Christianity is the fastest growing religion in the world.